For the first time in decades, Sweden is introducing border controls. Now, it's all part of efforts to deal with the large number of refugees trying to reach Europe. But today, we want to look at those whose desperate journey is over and what happens to the refugees then. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, Europe's most migration-friendly country is starting to groan under the pressure of its open borders. Sweden has introduced temporary border controls in the south of the country, saying it can no longer guarantee shelter for the thousands of refugees who are crossing through every day. Now, the country has accepted more asylum seekers relative to the size of its population than any other European country. Almost 200,000 refugees and migrants are expected to claim asylum by the end of this year. And Sweden says the burden is becoming too much to handle. The border checks will be in place for at least 10 days. But Sweden's Prime Minister says this is only a first step, and he's one of the many EU leaders in Malta this week calling for a new system to manage the crisis. Now, they met African leaders at this migration summit to offer them more than $2 billion in emergency funding. Now, in return, they want African leaders to help control the numbers leaving for Europe and to more readily take back unsuccessful applicants. Well, aside from the refugees fleeing Eritrea, most of the people moving from Africa to Europe are migrants. They're looking for work and a better life. And the EU hopes that this money can be used to address the economic problems that drive people out of African countries in the first place. Well, $2 billion may sound like a lot of money, but it's actually less than the cost of resettling and integrating the migrants who come to Europe. Sweden expects to spend around $7 billion on refugees by the end of 2016. And one think tank based in Munich estimates that Germany will spend more than $22 billion on refugees this year alone. And that's because it's not just about the cost of housing and food, it's about resettlement, including schools and healthcare. And complete integration requires language classes and job training. OK, let's bring in our guests now. In Brussels, we have Elizabeth Collett, who's Director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe. In Birmingham, we have Nando Sigona, a Senior Lecturer at the University of Birmingham. And in London, we have Sarosh Zaiwala, who's Senior Partner and Founder of Zaiwala & Co. Solicitors. Sarosh is a specialist on immigration law and EU migration. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on Inside Story. Can I start by giving you a fictional refugee? His name is Mohammed. He comes from Syria. He's witnessed some awful things in the country that he has fled. He's travelling with his wife and, say, 2 children. Can I come to you first, Sarosh? And let's assume he's arrived after a very, very perilous journey. He's arrived in London. What awaits him and his family there?
If he has arrived in London and if he's a genuine refugee, then under the international law, the UK government has a duty, a legal duty, to give him the status of a refugee, but not if he's an economic migrant. And remember, making him a refugee does not give him a permanent residence. He's only allowed to stay as long as the insecure condition which prevailed in the country from which he migrated remains. OK, all right. Elizabeth, let's assume that our fictional refugee, Mohammed, fulfills all of the criteria. What does the host community need to offer to Mohammed and his family?
Well, I mean, that can vary from country to country and what's available in each country. And what we're finding right now is that local authorities in many countries are really overstretched and trying to stretch their own scarce resources to support new arrivals in their communities. But at basic, there needs to be some form of integration policies and support for people, perhaps counselling for traumatised individuals, thinking through access to public services, from education for his children through to longer term access to the labour market and thinking through how to begin to develop a life in a community. Now, some of that can be provided by the government, but also communities themselves can be a critical factor in whether someone manages to be welcomed in a new community.
So, Nando, it's a huge undertaking then, isn't it, for any country, for any government, both national and local, to receive refugees from outside the region, quite often from a very different culture?
No, really. Actually, refugees are a great opportunity for those countries. You just look at Germany. I mean, in a sense, with their sort of open policies, they are really doing something good for the refugees in terms of providing support at a critical moment in their life. But they're also going to get a very strong human capital that will contribute to the German economy very soon. And this is what they're actually doing with their policies. I mean, Germany is working towards a very quick integration in the labor market. And it's also a very intelligent strategy, because basically it's empty. One of the criticisms that often is made to the refugee as if they are a burden on the welfare state. So if you manage to get people that have got skills, have got capacity in the job market soon, then you sort of can empty that kind of criticism.
Right. Well, Elizabeth, so a lot then would depend upon the level of skills that the refugee has as to how successful he or she could eventually be integrated into the labour market?
Well, I think you really have to look not just at the skills that someone presents, and I don't mean their university qualifications or particular engineering or medical qualifications, but also the informal skills that someone presents. Someone who may have spent a number of years working in a particular skilled trade, for example, of which we have great need within Europe. But the second factor is whether systems within EU member states have the capacity to recognise those skills or create equivalence between the skills someone presents and the skills that are needed in the labour market through bridging programmes, through short-term vocational training programmes. And that's a major challenge for the European Union. It's one thing for someone to turn up presenting their skills and saying, I'm a skills individual. It's another thing for the systems within that country to be able to adapt those skills and be able to then apply them to the labour market. And I think several countries have had real challenges with labour market access in recent years. Sweden, for example, is a country that's seen significant numbers of refugees, not just this year, but in previous years, has invested enormous amounts into labour market integration, developing programmes, language programmes that are vocational in nature, local level support services and mentoring systems to get people into the labour market, and still their refugee populations tend to lag a great deal behind native populations when it comes to employment opportunities, because sometimes those gaps can't be bridged, particularly if someone arrives with a lower level of skills. So the investment part of this is really, really important.
And Sarosh, you obviously operate in the UK. Give us an idea of how communities of refugees or migrants have been received there. I come from London myself and know that groups of migrants have not had a particularly easy time of it. I'm thinking perhaps of the Eastern Europeans, the Poles in particular.
But it's most important to distinguish between those who are economic migrants and refugees. If they are refugees, then the law requires them to be looked after.
But you can't legislate for attitudes, can you?
No, you cannot. But you have to keep in mind the culture also. For example, England at the moment as people believe it is quite crowded. It's a small island, and the jobs are not there, and therefore the government itself does not have the resources and is going for cuts. For the social security benefit cuts. And if there are going to be more refugees, and if they come in an unplanned manner, and England accepts, we must keep in mind that there might be a backlash from the community, the voters. And therefore it's important that the cultural side has to be looked at, and the government must ensure that people are ready to accept refugees.
And Nando, I see you shaking your head at that.
Honestly, the UK and the British government have had such a marginal role in the resettlement program at the moment they're having. I mean, they have really tried to play it against all the attempt by the European Union to develop a shared approach to the migration crisis. If you look at the number of people that have been accepted on the resettlement program that has been very announced with with a lot of fanfare, are minimal. We were talking of a few hundreds people in 2015. And the government that promised to resettle 20,000 people over 5 years, and basically just gambling on the fact that the Syrian crisis is no longer lasting so long. I think there have been countries that have done much more effort in terms of promoting a better approach to the crisis, giving opportunity to people to resettle, to start a new life, but also protection in the short term, not necessarily for the long term. We shouldn't forget that very often, in case of forced migration, of refugee crisis, the people tend to stay away from the home only for the time that the crisis lasts. And a lot of people will want to go back to Syria or to Eritrea if the conditions change there.
Okay, but these problems look to be pretty intractable right now, don't they? There doesn't seem to be any change on the horizon for Eritrea, and Syria is in a quagmire of conflict despite recent diplomatic manoeuvres.
Sure. This is why the policy that the UK government is following, which is let's keep them in the camps around the region, doesn't work anymore. I mean, if the crisis was lasting 1 or 2 years, people were happy to stay in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Turkey because they could see the possibility of going back to Syria. I mean, after 4 years of civil war, that possibility is no longer there. I mean, there is no longer a country, there is no economic infrastructure. People have lost everything. So it will take long time to rebuild Syria.
All right. Okay. Elizabeth, coming back then
to...
Well, sorry, Elizabeth, just coming back then to the main issue of how these groups of people are integrated. I mean, it would take a major commitment, wouldn't it, of policy on the part of the host government to make sure that these people are given all the support that they need to become functioning and valuable members of society.
Yes, and one of the challenges, particularly with respect to that, is that during the recession of the last 6 years, or even longer, a number of governments sort of retrenched their integration investments and pulled back on investing in integration for immigrant groups over the past decade, which means that some of that basis for investment and those programs aren't there at the moment. Now, we've seen countries, and particularly the German government, allocate specifically money for the regions to start building up their capacity for integration even further. But it is going to be something that doesn't just cost this year or next year, but this is a long-term investment that European governments will be making. Because, and I think as Nando says, the reality here is that people may well be here for the long term, and we should be planning for that. And one of the challenges across the European Union is that some countries are recognizing that and offering a fairly open access to a long-term residence within the European Union. Other countries are still thinking in terms of temporary protection, and countries like Germany and Sweden are considering moving backwards from permanent residence to temporary protection, which also has an integration effect on someone, not just in terms of the programs that are provided and the language support and the labour market access support, but in terms of psychologically, do I have a right to reside here on a permanent basis or on a temporary basis? And the community around me, do they understand that I may well become a member of their community in the long term, or am I just here on a temporary basis? And that lack of clarity, I think, across the European Union is something that we really do have to consider. What is the consistency of that message? If we are just offering temporary protection, then what does that encompass? And what is the plan then for reconstruction in a post-conflict situation in many of the countries where people are coming from? And is that robust?
And Nando, many countries in Europe, of course, are suffering a declining population, both in terms of birth rate and in terms of emigration. In the Baltics, for instance, many of the young working-age people are moving to Western Europe. So these populations could arguably then happily receive a new injection of people.
This is true, but you're important. But you also have to think of the way that the labour market works. I mean, in a sense, a lot of people tend to go where there is this assumption that people follow the welfare benefits, which is actually, there is very little evidence about it. What is sometimes driving people, and even as not maybe the main factor, but the secondary factor, is that they move towards where they can see an opportunity for them to restart their life. So where there is a job market that may be more open to them. And this is why people are moving to Germany, by far, because it's the strongest economy in Europe at the moment. Some of them would like to move to England, but the UK has been very close, as they said earlier on. So I think it's really important to see the refugees as an opportunity, but we still need to remember always that they are refugees and they need protection first and foremost. So we think about the economic interdiction, their role, we should think it's in the medium long term. Then there is an immediate need for support if they are refugees.
And Sarosh, can you tell us a little bit about your experience of dealing with migrants or refugees who've come to the UK, and then how their progress has gone or not gone? Can you tell us a little bit from your own personal experience?
First of all, from my own experience, I can say that most of the refugees and migrants who come to the United Kingdom ultimately have no real plans to go back. They don't want to go back for holidays, but hardly 3 or 4% ever want to go back to their home country to settle down. And we must keep in mind that we are in Europe is governed by the principle of rule of law. And therefore, those who the country should allow are those who they comply with the legal requirements. And that is very, very important, because it's completely unfair to those migrants who want to come through the process of law, qualify, work hard, and they should not be at a disadvantage, because unqualified migrant comes as refugees, even if they're not refugees, but they're economic migrants. And that is very important, that we accept the process of law, the rule of law principle.
Indeed, but once, as I mentioned before, once these criteria have been fulfilled, and particularly for people who are coming from conflict, particularly the Syrians right now and the Eritreans who are fleeing an oppressive system, once those criteria have been fulfilled, then how is their progress, how do they progress in the British system? I know that Britain does have a fairly closed-door policy at the moment, but from your experience, how have they managed and have they been integrated?
In fact, those who have been accepted as a refugee, they have been integrated very, very well. I have quite a few clients and friends who have been refugees, and they are well settled, they're looked after, they're given social security benefit, their children are given education benefits, so there is no problem at all. Once they are accepted as they have the refugee status, then UK is absolutely no difficulty at all, and they are looked after and cared for. And I can say that from my own personal experience.
Okay. Nando, again, coming back to what appears to be a policy muddle for much of Europe at the moment. They don't know whether they're coming or going. They really haven't got a unified approach as to how to deal with this influx of people. But you, along with the World Bank, as well as others, are highlighting the economic benefit. This will actually help the GDP, the growth rates of so many of these European economies after some time.
I guess that the refugees, especially the one they are coming, if you look at the demographic profile, are often young and full of energy. Some of them are well educated. In general, they got a level of education that may be higher than the resident population, especially for some groups rather than others. So there is an opportunity there. Which is important. Let me say something about the UK government, but not just the current one, also the previous one, in terms of what happens once someone gets the refugee status. It's normally refugees, it's true they get support, but there is a lot that needs to be done to do something for their skills to be made useful to the job market. I mean, there is much more resources that need to go, as Elizabeth was saying earlier, into converting titles that are gained elsewhere, in give the chance to get certificates for vocational training. It's all an area that has been very under-resourced in the last few years. And now we need to catch up with it, because we basically, if you look at the acceptance rates of asylum application in Europe, it's fairly high. I mean, many countries is well above the 50%. And people who get a status, especially a long-term status, we need to think about integration policies that are well funded, because then otherwise in 10 years' time we start to complain about having a disenfranchised population, excluded, depending on welfare system, etc.
And we've talked, Elizabeth, we've talked a lot about education, we've talked a little bit about schooling and housing, but what about religious integration? Because, of course, a large number of the refugees are from conflict areas like Syria, many of whom are Muslim, coming predominantly to secular countries. How does that work?
Well, I'm not an expert on religious and cultural accommodation within the European Union, and particularly not with Muslim populations. I think, there is a significant Muslim population already within the European Union, so there is the availability and the knowledge of how different faiths live together. I don't know that that necessarily creates a particular pressure. There have been concerns about radicalization of disaffected refugees who arrive in Europe and find that it's not all that it was hoped to be. I've been hearing security people talking about that. But I've also heard about different tensions within the Muslim community with different nationalities and different groups of arrivals, creating fights in refugee camps. So there are tensions that need to be considered, but it's not as if this is a new prospect for the European Union. The European Union is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious continent. So take the tensions seriously, but I think don't overplay the fact that this is a number of people coming from Muslim countries, because they're also coming from a broad range of countries with a broad range of backgrounds.
And Nando, when there is entry of a new group of either migrants or refugees, quite often there is a backlash, isn't there, from a host community. Very negative attitudes, particularly in Britain, are helped along by some of the right-wing press. But also there's downright racism that can come from host communities. This is a problem that will also have to be contended with.
It is a problem, and it's really important the way that the process is managed. We know that in the 2000s, for example, the UK organized a dispersal program by which people that were arriving claiming asylum had no power to decide where they want to settle down. So you had a lot of people scattered in communities which didn't have really a history of welcoming migrants and refugees, and tension arose. It's really interesting that if you look instead at cities and areas which have got an history of migration, where there is already an existing communities from their country of origin, things can get much easier in terms of integration of the newcomers within the established community. This is possibly also one of the limits of the EU program of relocation, because it doesn't really give the choice of the people that they want to relocate, the Syrians or the Eritreans, to choose which country they want to go. Often people may have distant family members, friends in specific countries, and those friends are really important to help them to settle down, especially in the beginning when they are disoriented and they don't understand how the things works. So those are resources that should be mobilized rather than being excluded by the process, by choices that are very centralized at top-down.
And Sarosh, quite often, which I find this particularly interesting, is quite often those who are most vehemently against new groups entering into society are either refugees or migrants or the descendants of themselves.
Yes, I can tell you why this is so, because I am also an immigrant and I have full sympathy, and I can understand the plight of the refugees. But we are always very concerned about the backlash from the majority community. We want to live together. We have migrated. We have assimilated in the United Kingdom. But one does see the undercurrent. Very occasionally one finds that when you are in a wide circle, they say, well, we are being flooded by all these people. And we don't want a backlash which affects all of us. And therefore, for our own security, what we all feel as immigrants ourselves, that people are welcome and should be welcome, but they must be welcomed according to the proper process. In that process, the Parliament must take into consideration also the wishes of the ordinary people on the ground.
Okay.
And that is something very important.
OK. Elizabeth, I'll give the final word to you. No country seems to have the perfect system of integration, does it? There's quite a bit of work to be done. Are you surprised at how the Swedes, who we've described already as being perhaps the most migrant-friendly, are you surprised at how they're managing this crisis?
No, I mean, I think the Swedish government has been one of the most open in recent years, both to refugees but also to economic migrants. It's invested more and more consistently than many other governments in integration, but I think their experience demonstrates how difficult it can be to really do this successfully. And also it depends a great deal on the profile of the people arriving in your country. I mean, Sweden has a large number of refugees, many of whom do not come with skills and have very low skills, and the Swedish economy doesn't quite know how to address that. The Swedish economy isn't geared towards that. So there is that question of how do we make that bridge between the people we may want in our labour markets and the people who arrive.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. We're out of time, but can I thank you, Elizabeth Collett, Nando Sigona and Sarosh Zaiwala. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part in this conversation. And as ever, thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or, of course, you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thank you again for watching from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team. It's bye for now.